Welcome! Tonight we drift back to another time, another summer, another story. The year is 1863. The air is warm. The fields are green. And across the United States, a war is raging. But here in Pennsylvania, in the rolling hills and quiet towns, peace still lingers. For the moment. This is the story of Gettysburg. The American Civil War had already burned for more than 2 years. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, families torn apart by loyalty, by belief, by geography. The Union, the North, fought to preserve the United States, to hold the nation together as one. The Confederacy, the South, fought for independence, for the right to go their own way, and for the continuation of slavery, the system that supported their wealth and power. It was a war of politics, a war of ideals, but also a war of desperation. By the summer of 1863, hundreds of thousands of lives had already been lost. Battles at places like Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, each battle leaving scars, each battle promising that this war would not end quickly. The North had the advantage in numbers, factories, and money. But the South had skillful generals and unshakable determination. And in the East, one man had risen above all others. His name was Robert E. Lee, General of the Army of Northern Virginia. Confident, charismatic, admired by his soldiers, respected by his enemies, Lee had led the Confederacy to impressive victories. He had outmaneuvered Union commanders again and again. At Fredericksburg, he had crushed them. At Chancellorsville, he had stunned them. His army was smaller, poorly supplied, often hungry. But somehow, Lee kept winning, and now he wanted more. Lee understood the danger. The Confederacy could not fight forever. The North had too many men, too many resources, too much industry. If the war dragged on, the South would be strangled slowly, choked by Union ships blocking its ports, crushed by Union armies pushing deeper into its land. So Lee made a bold decision. He would invade the North. He would march his army into Pennsylvania, far from Southern fields, far from Richmond, the Confederate capital. If he could win there, on Union soil, it might break the will of the North to continue fighting. It might convince Great Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. And it might force President Abraham Lincoln to negotiate peace. For Lee, it was a chance at victory. For the Confederacy, it was a chance at survival. On the other side, the Union had a new commander, General George Gordon Meade. Meade was not a household name. He was not flamboyant. He was not celebrated in newspapers, but he was calm, serious, methodical. The kind of leader who preferred caution over recklessness. The kind of man who would not gamble with his army's life unless he had to. Meade had just been given command of the Union's Army of the Potomac, only days before the battle that would define him. It was a heavy burden, but Meade accepted it quietly, without drama, without show. 2 generals, 2 armies, 2 different styles, both moving steadily toward a meeting neither had fully planned, but neither could avoid. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of soldiers, marching day after day. Confederate soldiers in faded gray, dusty from the road. Union soldiers in blue, shadowing them from a distance. The rumble of wagon wheels, the steady clop of horse hooves, the endless rhythm of boots against dirt. Villagers paused to watch the columns pass. Farmers stood by their fences. Children peeked from behind doors, eyes wide at the sight of so many men. For many in Pennsylvania, this was the first time war had come so close. It was a frightening sight, but also a strange and unforgettable one. And still, the land itself remained beautiful. Pennsylvania in summer was alive. Fields of wheat swayed in the warm wind. Apple orchards hung heavy with fruit. Streams sparkled under soft sunlight. Birds sang in the hedgerows. It was as though nature cared little for the struggles of men, as though the earth itself continued its quiet rhythm, even as armies passed by. For the townsfolk of Gettysburg, life carried on. Shops opened in the morning. Children went to school. Farmers tended their crops. The war was near, but not here. Not yet. Robert E. Lee felt confident. Perhaps too confident. His men adored him. His victories had built a sense of invincibility. Even without Stonewall Jackson, his brilliant second-in-command, lost at Chancellorsville, Lee believed his army could triumph. He trusted his corps commanders. James Longstreet, dependable and practical. Richard Ewell, bold but unpredictable. A.P. Hill, young and aggressive. Together, Lee believed, they could carry the South to glory. But confidence is a dangerous thing. It can inspire. It can strengthen. But it can also blind. Lee believed his men could win anything. But war is rarely so simple. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Lincoln waited anxiously. The Union had suffered defeats. Northern morale was shaken. The public was weary of war. A victory for Lee in the North might shatter support for the Union cause. It might even threaten Lincoln's presidency. And so pressure weighed heavily on General Meade. He could not fail. He could not allow Lee to triumph on Union soil. Meade did not boast. He did not promise miracles. But quietly, firmly, he prepared. As June turned July, both armies closed in on each other. Neither planned to fight at Gettysburg, but the crossroads town drew them like a magnet. Roads from the north, south, east, and west all converged there. It was a natural meeting place, a place where movement became unavoidable. And so, without intention, the stage was set. Two armies, each more than 70,000 strong, drifting ever closer, marching toward a collision, marching toward history. Yet, for just a little longer, peace remained. The people of Gettysburg enjoyed their summer routines. Church bells rang on Sunday mornings. Shops sold their goods. Children played in the streets. The hills rolled gently into the distance. The sky stretched endlessly above. It was ordinary. It was calm. It was safe. No one knew that within days, the streets would fill with soldiers. The churches would become hospitals. The fields would become graveyards. No one knew that Gettysburg was about to become the most famous battlefield of the Civil War. And so, we pause here, at the quiet before the storm, at the edge of history. The summer air is warm. The hills are silent. The fields are still. Two armies are marching closer. Two generals are preparing, each in his own way. And a small town in Pennsylvania waits, unaware of the destiny about to fall upon it. This is the opening, the beginning of a story that will echo forever. The story of Gettysburg. The summer deepened. The armies marched, and history began to shift. Robert E. Lee had made his choice. The Confederate Army would not remain in Virginia. It would not simply defend. It would strike outward, northward, into Pennsylvania. Picture it. Long columns of soldiers in gray uniforms, their clothes worn from endless marches, their boots caked with dust, their rifles resting on their shoulders. Behind them, wagons rattled along uneven roads. Horses pulled artillery, creaking wheels echoing into the hills. And in those columns, tens of thousands of men. Farm boys, clerks, teachers, fathers and sons, all of them following Lee, trusting him, believing in his vision. They moved steadily through the Shenandoah Valley, crossed the Potomac River, and entered Maryland, then Pennsylvania. For many Confederate soldiers, It was the first time they had set foot so far north. The land looked different, richer, greener. Farms stretched wide with sturdy barns and fields heavy with crops. The soldiers noticed the abundance, and some could not resist. Cattle were taken, horses borrowed, food supplies gathered by force. For the farmers and townsfolk of Pennsylvania, the war that had once seemed distant was suddenly at their doors. Imagine their fear. One morning they woke to see dust rising on the horizon. Then the faint sound of drums, the glimmer of bayonets catching the sunlight. And soon, the road outside their house filled with men. An army, foreign yet American, familiar yet frightening. For some townspeople it was terrifying. Doors were locked, families hid valuables, children were pulled inside. For others, it was simply bewildering. They watched quietly, unsure what to say, unsure whether to wave or to turn away, and always the same question lingered. Would these men bring battle? Would gunfire soon echo in their quiet streets? The Confederate army spread wide across the Pennsylvania countryside. Cavalry rode ahead, gathering supplies, scouting the land. Infantry followed mile after mile until the landscape seemed filled with soldiers. Lee's plan was grand. He wanted to gather food and supplies from Pennsylvania's fertile land. He wanted to draw the Union Army north, away from Virginia's scarred fields. And if possible, he wanted to find and defeat them once more. But Lee also hoped for something less tangible. He hoped the march itself would sow fear in the North, that townsfolk would panic, that newspapers would spread alarm, that politicians in Washington would feel the weight of danger pressing close. Every step his soldiers took was a message. The South could march where it wished. The war was not contained. No one was safe. But the Confederates were not alone. The Union Army was moving too. General George Meade had taken command only days before. It was not an easy assignment. He had little time to prepare, little time to know his officers, little time to inspire his men. But he did not hesitate. He shadowed Lee carefully, never rushing too far ahead, never falling too far behind. It was like a great dance, one army pushing forward, the other following step for step. And all the while, no one knew exactly where they would meet. Pennsylvania felt the tension. Word spread quickly. Lee is coming. The rebels are near. Armies are moving. In towns across the countryside, people whispered. Church congregations prayed. Farmers wondered whether to flee or to stay. Some families packed wagons with what little they could carry and left. Others stayed, watching the roads nervously, hoping the storm would pass them by. Children listened to the distant rumble of artillery wheels. Merchants closed shops. Women gathered food, fearing soldiers might take it. The ordinary rhythms of life were breaking. The war was no longer a story in newspapers. It was here, at their doorstep. And then there was Gettysburg, a small town. Unremarkable until history found it, Gettysburg was not a fortress. It was not a capital. It was not even a city of great size. It was a town of a few thousand people, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, teachers. Its streets were lined with brick and wooden houses, a few churches, a courthouse, a college. What made Gettysburg special were its roads. 10 major roads met in the town. From the north, south, east, and west, they converged like spokes on a wheel. Whoever held Gettysburg could move easily in any direction. It was a crossroads, and in war, crossroads are magnets. Neither army planned to fight there, but the roads would draw them together. unknowingly, inevitably. Imagine the town in those days. Children chasing each other through the square. Merchants arranging goods in their shop windows. Farmers coming in from the countryside to sell their produce. Life, as ordinary as ever. But under the surface, unease. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said Confederate cavalry was already near. Others said the Union Army would camp in the town. And yet, the fields still glowed with sunlight. The orchards still carried fruit. The sky still stretched endlessly blue. Gettysburg did not know that within days its name would be forever carved into history. For the soldiers, the march north was exhausting. Feet blistered, clothes worn thin, food scarce, but they pressed on. Some sang songs to keep rhythm. Others joked quietly with their comrades. Many simply marched in silence, step after step, mile after mile. The Union soldiers felt pressure too. They did not know exactly where Lee was heading, but they knew they must stop him. They knew the safety of their homes, their families, and their nation depended on it. And so, two vast armies moved across Pennsylvania, neither able to see the full picture, both searching, both waiting. At night, campfires dotted the hills, thousands of tiny flames glowing against the darkness. Men cooked meager meals. Letters were written by flickering light. Songs drifted softly from one camp to another. And above them, the stars shone quietly, unmoved by the struggles below. The people of Pennsylvania watched all this with anxious eyes. Some tried to continue their daily routines. Some offered water or bread to passing soldiers. Others closed their shutters tightly, wishing the war would pass them by. Every knock on the door brought dread. Would it be soldiers demanding food? Would it be news of a coming battle? Would it be neighbors asking whether to flee? The uncertainty was heavy. Each day brought new rumors. Each day, the sound of distant drums grew louder. And so, step by step, the march continued. The Confederate army stretched across miles of countryside. Its cavalry under General Jeb Stuart rode ahead, though not always where Lee expected. Its infantry spread wide, searching for supplies, searching for the Union Army. The Union Army followed, careful not to stumble into a trap. Meade consulted his generals. He studied the maps. He weighed each move carefully. Neither side rushed. Neither side retreated. Both pressed forward, shadows of one another. And every mile they marched drew them closer to Gettysburg. In the end, it was not grand strategy that brought them there. It was chance, a meeting of roads, a search for shoes, supplies, and information, a Union cavalryman riding west of town, a Confederate brigade pushing forward from the north, two paths crossing almost accidentally. And with that crossing, the spark was lit. But for now, pause here. At the march itself, at the movement of tens of thousands of men step after step across Pennsylvania's rolling hills. The countryside is still green. The sky is still calm. The war is not yet broken upon Gettysburg. But it is close now. Very close. The town waits quietly. The roads are ready. And the armies are almost here. The greatest battle of the Civil War is about to begin. The morning of July 1st. The air is still. The fields around Gettysburg are quiet, the sky pale with dawn. Crows stir in the trees, farmers wake in their homes, and the town itself moves into a new day. No one knows what is coming. Not the children hurrying down the narrow streets, not the women opening shop shutters, not the men leading horses out to pasture. It begins, almost gently. To the west of Gettysburg, Confederate troops are on the move. General Henry Heth commands a division. He sends his men forward along the Chambersburg Pike. At first, his objective seems simple. The men have heard that Gettysburg might hold supplies, especially shoes. The long march north has worn many pairs thin. So Heth orders a probing movement. Just a small push toward the town. Not a grand attack, not a set battle. Only reconnaissance, and perhaps resupply. It is in truth a modest decision. Yet it will open the door to the greatest battle of the war. Waiting for them is Union cavalry, under the command of Brigadier General John Buford. Buford is no stranger to cavalry tactics. He knows the value of high ground. And in the rolling hills west of Gettysburg he sees a chance. Two ridges run north to south. McPherson's Ridge first, and Seminary Ridge just behind it. Buford positions his men along these lines, not to win a full battle, but to delay, to hold, to buy time. For Buford knows the Union infantry is still on the march. He knows they will need hours to arrive. And until then, it falls to his cavalry to resist. Picture the scene. Union cavalrymen dismount. They line fences. They crouch behind stone walls. They set up carbines, their shorter rifles designed for fast fire. Horseholders lead the animals to the rear. The men prepare for what is coming. They are not many, but Buford believes the ridges will serve them well. The high ground, a natural defense. The open fields before them, a clear view of any advancing troops. It is a quiet sort of courage. They do not expect to win. They only expect to delay. The Confederates appear first as shapes in the distance, columns moving down the pike, the glint of metal in the sun, the flutter of flags in the warm breeze. They advance steadily, unaware of the strength before them. Some think they will meet only local militia, perhaps frightened townsfolk, perhaps no resistance at all. But as they near the ridges, Union carbines crack. The first shots of Gettysburg. Smoke curls above the fields. Horses rear at the sound, and men fall, stunned at the sudden resistance. The skirmish begins small, scattered exchanges of fire, cavalry holding behind fences, Confederates answering back with musket volleys. Neither side yet sees the scale of what is forming. For both, it feels like an encounter, not a battle. Yet the sound of gunfire carries. It echoes across the countryside, and with each echo, more soldiers are drawn toward it. Buford rides along his line. Calm, steady, reassuring his men. He knows this is only the beginning. He knows larger Confederate forces are near. But he also knows Union reinforcements are marching hard to reach him. If he can hold just long enough, then when the main army arrives, they will have the advantage of the ground. It is, in essence, a race against time. A slow-burning race measured in hours and casualties. Meanwhile, the people of Gettysburg hear the sounds. A farmer plowing a field pauses, listening to the distant crack of rifles. A shopkeeper glances up from his counter as the noise drifts through the morning air. Children stop in their play, puzzled by the faint thunder rolling from the west. At first, some think it is just drilling. Soldiers practicing maneuvers. But soon, the truth becomes clear. The war has reached them. The fighting on McPherson's Ridge grows sharper. Confederate skirmishers spread out through the fields. They fire from behind trees, from fence lines, from shallow ditches. Union cavalry answers back with disciplined bursts. Their carbines fire quickly, reloading faster than muskets. It allows them to hold longer than the Confederates expect. Still, the pressure builds. More Confederate brigades move in. The encounter swells like a stream becoming a river. For the soldiers themselves, it feels strange. Many did not expect serious combat that morning. Some had only just broken camp. Others had been thinking more of food and rest than of fighting. And now, they are thrown into a contest neither side planned. One shot answered by another. one regiment reinforcing another, until suddenly it is no longer a skirmish. It is the opening of Gettysburg. Buford's men cling to their ground. Every fence, every stone wall, every dip in the earth becomes a line of defense. Horses stamp nervously in the rear. Messengers ride back and forth, carrying orders across the ridges. The smoke thickens. The sun climbs higher. The fields of wheat sway in the summer air, even as bullets cut through them. Still Buford holds. The Confederate officers begin to sense this will not be simple. What they thought was militia is something more. Well armed, well positioned, determined. So they commit more men. Brigades move forward in lines. Artillery is drawn into position. The clash deepens, but it remains strangely calm in its unfolding. Not yet the thunder of a great battle, more like a steady building of pressure, a tide rising inch by inch. In Gettysburg itself, the sound grows louder. Families gather belongings, unsure whether to flee. Some hide in cellars. Others climb rooftops to watch. A few, curious, even walk toward the sound until fear turns them back. The town is caught between normal life and something larger. An ordinary morning interrupted by history. On the ridges, Buford peers through his field glasses. He sees the dust of Confederate columns in the distance. He knows more are coming. But he also knows help is near. Union infantry under General John Reynolds is on the march. They are hurrying toward Gettysburg. And if they can reach the ridges in time, Buford's delaying action will have done its work. So the cavalry fights on, not to win outright, but to buy those precious hours. The skirmishes lengthen. Confederates push. Cavalry bends but does not break. The morning stretches forward hour by hour. The sun grows hotter, the smoke thicker, the lines deeper, and with each passing moment the accidental battle expands. It is worth pausing here. The Battle of Gettysburg, later so vast, so legendary, does not begin with grandeur. It begins with the division searching for shoes. It begins with cavalrymen buying time. It begins with ordinary soldiers stepping into fire almost by chance. There is no grand trumpet call, no sweeping declaration, only the quiet, steady rhythm of shots exchanged across Pennsylvania fields. Yet from this rhythm, history unfolds. The Confederates believe they are pressing into a small force. They cannot yet see the Union infantry approaching. They do not realize how much resistance is gathering. The Union cavalry believes they are barely holding on. They do not yet see how their effort is shaping the ground for the larger army. And the people of Gettysburg, they simply hear the noise growing hour after hour, wondering what it means for their town. As the morning advances, reinforcements arrive for both sides. Union infantry finally begins to appear on the scene. Confederates commit more brigades into the fight. The ridges, once quiet with birdsong, are now filled with the sound of volleys. The meadows are trampled by boots and hooves. The fences splinter under fire. And still, it is only the beginning. By late morning, the small encounter has become something more. What started as reconnaissance has drawn in divisions. What began as skirmish has become the first day of Gettysburg. The men on both sides feel it now. The pressure, the weight, the sense that something larger is forming around them. Yet no one, not even the generals, knows how vast it will grow. Not yet. For now, the ridges hold. The cavalry stands. The Confederates push. The Union waits for strength to arrive. The morning of July 1st closes with the field alive with fire. And the great battle has quietly begun. The 1st of July had begun with small sparks of battle. Cavalry skirmishes, scattered shots in the fields west of Gettysburg. But by noon, those sparks had grown into fire. Now the afternoon hours unfolded, slow and heavy beneath the summer sun. and with them came the weight of entire armies. From the dusty Pennsylvania roads, Confederate divisions were arriving. Not just scouts or brigades, whole bodies of men, column after column winding their way toward the small crossroads town. From the north came Robert Rodes's division, moving down from Oak Hill. From the northeast, Jubal Early's men pressed forward, pushing through the countryside. Their uniforms were worn, faded, many patched with rough stitching. But their steps were steady. They had marched far, yet their spirits were high. They believed the day belonged to them. They had pushed the Union cavalry back through the morning. They had seen blue-coated soldiers falling away. And with every hour, more of their brothers in gray arrived to strengthen the line. It was as though a tide rolled steadily toward Gettysburg, each wave higher than the last. The Union was not idle. Reinforcements were rushing too. The First Corps had entered under General John Reynolds. And though Reynolds fell in the morning, struck down in the early fight, his men pressed forward with grim resolve. They spread themselves thinly across ridges west of the town. McPherson's Ridge, Seminary Ridge, patches of woodland and stretches of open field. They held there waiting for more comrades to arrive, waiting for the 11th Corps under General Howard. Every fence line, every farmhouse, every orchard became a makeshift defense. Union soldiers crouched low behind stone walls. They leveled rifles over split-rail fences. They braced themselves against the weight they knew was coming. By early afternoon, the sound of musketry filled the air. Not scattered shots anymore. Rolling volleys echoing across the farmland. Artillery joined in. Cannon positioned on ridges thundering across the open ground. The calm Pennsylvania countryside, now a storm. Smoke gathered like low clouds drifting among the trees. Sunlight shone through in hazy shafts. The smell of powder, sharp and bitter, hung in the throat. Yet for the people of Gettysburg, the townsfolk watching anxiously, it all still felt unreal. They had seen soldiers before. They had watched armies march by. But now the fight had come into their very fields. Every sound carried into the streets, rattling windows and shaking doors. Civilians peered out from shutters or huddled in root cellars. Mothers comforted children. Elderly neighbors whispered prayers. The town was holding its breath. On the ridges the Union fought bravely. Regiment after regiment held as long as they could. They fired, reloaded, and fired again. Officers called to steady the lines. Flags waved defiantly in the smoke. But the numbers were against them. As each Confederate division deployed, the Union stretched thinner. And with each passing hour, the pressure grew heavier. From the north, Rodes's men began to sweep down. Their ranks extended wide, pushing into the Union flank. From the northeast, Early's division came along the Harrisburg Road, threatening to envelop the Union from another side. It was as though gray wings were closing around the blue. Imagine it slowly. Fields once quiet with the buzz of summer insects now filled with the tramp of boots. Apple orchards shaken by cannon fire. Fences splintered under the weight of men vaulting over them. The Lutheran seminary building with its small cupola stood in the middle distance. Once a place of study, now a marker on a battlefield. Soldiers in blue tried to hold the ground before it, but as the sun angled lower, their lines bent, and then broke. The retreat began. Union men fell back through the streets of Gettysburg itself. It was not a graceful withdrawal. It was hurried, desperate, chaotic. Imagine narrow brick streets filled with running soldiers, horses clattering past, cannon wheels rattling over stones, blue uniforms disappearing into alleys weaving between shops and taverns. Confederates surged behind them. Shouts echoed between buildings. Muskets cracked in the close quarters of the town. Windows shattered. Walls were scarred with lead. For the townsfolk, the battle had entered their very doorsteps. Some locked themselves in basements. Others could only watch as the tide of men poured past. Through all this confusion, the Union Army searched for higher ground. And there, just south of town, rose Cemetery Hill. It was not tall by mountain standards, but in the rolling Pennsylvania countryside it was commanding. It overlooked the approaches to the town. Roads converged at its base, and to officers with a trained eye, it was clear. This was the ground to hold. So the Union retreated not in ruin, but in direction. They streamed through the streets and climbed the slopes of Cemetery Hill. There, panting and weary, they reformed their lines. They looked back toward Gettysburg, watching as the Confederates occupied the town they had just fled. Evening approached. The golden light of sunset touched the rooftops and fields. The roar of musketry softened. Here and there shots still cracked, but the thunder was fading. The Confederates now held the town itself. They had driven the Union through the streets. They had claimed the day's ground, and yet they had not pushed to Cemetery Hill. Some urged it could be taken now, in the dusk. The Union was disorganized, winded, still gathering itself. But General Lee held back. His men were scattered. His orders were cautious. He would wait. And in that waiting, the Union found a breath of life. So night fell over Gettysburg. Picture it gently. The smoke of battle drifting away into the cooling air. The fields littered with broken fences, abandoned knapsacks, silent forms lying where they had fallen. The town itself scarred, but hushed. Shadows grew long, then merged into darkness. Across the ridges and hills, campfires began to glow. Tiny dots of orange light, flickering against the night. On Cemetery Hill, the Union men settled themselves, weary but not broken. Some cooked what little they carried. Some drank from canteens. Others lay back, staring at the stars above. On the ridges north and west of town, Confederate fires glimmered too. Men sat in groups, murmuring quietly. Some sharpened bayonets. Others wrapped blankets tighter, grateful for rest after the long march. Between those two arcs of firelight lay the quiet town, caught in the valley of silence. The civilians of Gettysburg spent that night in uneasy quiet. Their homes were crowded with wounded. Every barn became a hospital, every church a ward. Groans and whispers drifted through the streets. Candles glowed behind curtained windows, and all the while the two armies waited. Let your mind rest on that image. A summer night in 1863. A town caught between two vast forces. Campfires glowing like fallen stars across the hillsides. The silence of thousands of men sleeping on the ground. The distant murmur of sentries at their posts. The knowledge that when dawn came, the battle would not only return but grow far greater. For now, it was a pause. A breath between storms, the stillness of evening after thunder. The first day of Gettysburg was over. The second day was waiting in the dark. The night had passed slowly over Gettysburg. A long, uneasy quiet, lit only by campfires scattered across the ridges and hills. Men lay on the hard ground, wrapped in thin blankets, their dreams unsettled by the memory of the day before. And then the dawn of July 2nd arrived, soft and pale at first. The sun rising over the Pennsylvania fields, its early light stretching across farms, meadows, and hills. Day 2 of the great battle had begun. For Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, this day carried a purpose. The first day had gone well for his army. They had driven the Union back through Gettysburg. They had forced them onto the high ground south of town. But the Union still held that ground. And Lee understood it clearly. If his army was to win, those heights had to be taken. So he studied the Union line. It curved in a great fishhook shape, starting from Culp's Hill on the right, sweeping down through Cemetery Hill, and then stretching along Cemetery Ridge all the way to two rocky hills at the southern end, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. It was a strong position, defensive, commanding, high. The Union Army had the advantage of terrain, but Lee believed it could be broken. His plan was direct. Strike at the Union flanks, roll them up from the ends, and the middle would crumble. He would send General James Longstreet's corps to attack the Union left, down toward the Round Tops, through the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den. Meanwhile, Richard Ewell's men on the Confederate left would keep pressure on the Union right, around Culp's Hill. If both ends could be pressed, the Union would be forced inward, squeezed together, and beaten. It was a bold vision, but boldness had carried Lee before. He trusted it might again. As the Confederates planned, the Union Army prepared too. General George Meade had arrived late on the night of July 1st. This was his first great test as commander of the Army of the Potomac. He had been given command only days before. Now he faced Robert E. Lee, and the stakes of the entire war seemed to hang over the ridges and fields before him. But Meade did not panic. He examined the ground. He saw the strength of the position, and he resolved to stand here, to fight here, and to hold. So in the early hours of July 2nd, Union soldiers stirred themselves awake upon the slopes of Cemetery Hill and Ridge. They formed their lines, stacked their rifles, and brewed coffee over small fires. They looked out over the open fields where the enemy waited. They knew what was coming, and they knew it would come soon. For now, though, the morning was still. Imagine the Pennsylvania countryside in that quiet light. The round hills at the southern end covered with scattered trees and rocky slopes. The open ground of the peach orchard, its fruit trees lined in rows, the grass beneath them wet with dew. The wheat field stretching wide, its stalks tall, rippling gently in the summer breeze. The tangled boulders of Devil's Den piled like the bones of ancient mountains. It was peaceful, almost timeless. And yet every inch of it would soon be contested ground. The calm before the storm. Union officers studied the terrain carefully. On Cemetery Ridge, they placed batteries of artillery. Cannon stood in long rows, their muzzles aimed outward toward the enemy lines. Infantry were positioned behind stone walls and fence lines. Regiments were shifted into place, filling the curve of the fishhook. On the far left, near the Round Tops, Union commanders debated how best to secure the ground. The hills were steep, wooded, and difficult to defend in numbers. Yet everyone could see, if those heights were lost, the Union flank would be dangerously exposed. They must be held at all cost. Meanwhile, across the way, Confederate soldiers awoke in their own camps. They stretched their legs after the long marches of the day before. They tightened belts, checked muskets, and refilled canteens. They whispered among themselves, wondering when the order to advance would come. Many were confident. They had seen the Union driven back on day one. They believed the enemy was shaken. They believed another hard push might finish the work. Yet not all was perfectly ready. Longstreet himself was uneasy. He urged Lee to move cautiously, to swing around and place the army between the Union and Washington. But Lee's resolve was firm. He wanted the attack here, now, on this ground. So the armies waited, their lines drawn, their nerves taut. The morning hours ticked by with a strange stillness. Here and there, picket lines exchanged small shots. A few skirmishes crackled in the distance, but the great storm of battle had not yet begun. Instead, there was only preparation, artillery being wheeled into place, brigades marching to their positions, men crouched behind stone fences, running whetstones along bayonets. The fields of Gettysburg lay silent in the sun, but everyone knew they would not remain silent for long. Picture the Union soldiers upon Cemetery Ridge, standing in their dark blue coats, their muskets resting at their sides. Their officers walking slowly behind the line, reminding them to stay steady, to trust their ground. Flags stirred in the breeze, their colors bright against the green fields. Now picture the Confederate soldiers gathering in the woods and fields opposite them. Gray and butternut uniforms, worn from long marches. Drums beating softly to keep ranks in order. Officers pointing toward the ridges, explaining where the attack would fall. Both sides could see each other in glimpses through the haze. Both sides knew they were being watched in turn. It was as though two great beasts circled each other, muscles coiled, waiting for the moment to strike. But for all the tension, there was still beauty in that morning. The orchards shimmered with sunlight, the peaches ripening on branches. Birds flitted between the trees, seemingly unaware of the armies crouched nearby. The wheat field waved in golden swells, untouched for now, as if it belonged to another world. The rocky slopes of the Round Top stood silent, their granite faces warmed by the sun. The land did not yet know the violence it was about to bear, but those who stood upon it, they could feel it coming. Like the weight of thunder before the lightning. Union engineers looked to strengthen their defenses. Stones were piled for breastworks. Fallen trees were dragged into rough barricades. Artillery officers measured distances, calculated ranges, and set their guns carefully. On the right flank, near Culp's Hill, Union troops dug in further. The ground there was wooded and steep, perfect for defense. If Lee's men struck there, they would face not only Union soldiers but the slope itself. On the left, though, things were less certain. The ground near the peach orchard and wheat field was open, exposed, difficult to anchor. Commanders argued over where exactly to position brigades. Some wanted to extend farther out. Others warned it was too risky. The debate stretched on, even as Confederate troops gathered across the way. And so the morning hours of July 2nd drifted by. A strange pause. An uneasy waiting game. Neither side yet ready to unleash its full strength. Neither willing to make the first thunderous move. But everyone knew it was coming. Imagine the scene as the sun climbed higher. From the slopes of Cemetery Ridge, a Union soldier might gaze down into the valley. He would see the fields spread wide, their grasses shimmering. He would see distant movement, shadows of men gathering in the tree lines, cannon wheels glinting faintly in the light. He would hear the occasional crack of a skirmisher's rifle. But mostly, he would hear the quiet, a heavy, tense quiet. And from the Confederate lines a soldier would look upward. He would see the blue ranks silhouetted against the ridge, their flags rippling. He would see cannon barrels waiting black and still. He would know that before long those cannon would roar. But for now, the silence held. Thus passed the morning of July 2nd, a time of preparation, of tension, of calm before violence. The Union line sat strong upon its high ground, curving like a shield around the hills. The Confederate army gathered its strength, ready to strike at the flanks. The peach orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, the Round Tops all lay quiet in the sun. But within hours, each would become a name etched in fire and blood. The morning belonged to stillness. The afternoon would belong to battle. The summer sun drifted higher over Gettysburg. It was July 2nd, 1863. The second day of the battle had begun in tension, but now, in the afternoon, the battlefield stirred with movement. General Robert E. Lee had made his choice. His plan was clear, if dangerous. Strike the Union Army on its flanks, break them apart, and perhaps bring victory to the Confederacy on Northern soil. But to do this, he turned to his trusted commander, General James Longstreet. Longstreet was steady, careful, a man who preferred strong positions to reckless charges. Yet duty pressed him forward. Lee ordered him to take 2 divisions and sweep against the Union left. That Union left stretched across rocky ground. It curved around fields and forests. There were small farms, stone walls, rolling hills, and at the far edge, the twin rises of Big Round Top and Little Round Top. At first glance, they seemed only rugged hills, but in war, high ground meant strength. And if the Confederates could take them, they could pour fire into the Union line below. So the stage was set. The afternoon would bring some of the hardest fighting of the entire battle. The Union Army held a strong defensive line. They called it a fishhook, bending around from Culp's Hill on the right, across Cemetery Hill, and down to the ridges near Round Top. It was not a straight wall, but a curve of protection. And at its lower end, on the left, the men of General Daniel Sickles' corps were stationed. Sickles was a politician turned general, brave but impulsive. He did not like the ground he had been assigned. It seemed too low, too vulnerable. So, against orders, he moved his men forward. He pushed them out into the peach orchard, creating a bulge in the Union line. This decision, bold but rash, would shape the entire afternoon. The Union line was no longer smooth. It jutted forward, exposed on both sides, and Lee's attack would crash right into that angle. In the early afternoon, Longstreet's men began their march. The sun beat down. Dust rose with every step. The soldiers moved quietly through fields and woods, trying to keep hidden from Union eyes. But such a mass could not remain unseen forever. By mid-afternoon, Confederate artillery opened fire. The deep rumble rolled across the fields, echoing off the hills. It was the signal the assault had begun. The first clash came at the peach orchard. It was a gentle place in peace, rows of trees spreading their branches, fruit beginning to ripen in the summer heat. But now, it became a battlefield. Confederate brigades surged forward. They struck Sickles' advanced position. Union artillery barked in return, firing over the orchard, shaking the ground. The trees shivered under the blasts, branches snapping, fruit falling to the trampled earth. The Union soldiers fought hard, but the line was thin. Artillery batteries fired until their guns grew hot, the smoke drifting thick across the orchard rows. Men fell among the blossoms and the churned soil. The orchard itself seemed to vanish in the storm of shot and shell. Bit by bit, the Union troops gave ground. The peach orchard became a ruin, and the Confederates pressed on. Beyond the orchard lay the wheat field. It was nearly 20 acres wide. Tall, golden stalks swayed in the summer air. Birds had once nested there. But this afternoon the field became a place of chaos. Wave after wave of men poured into it. Union brigades rushed in to hold the line. Confederate brigades stormed forward to push them out. The fighting surged back and forth like the tide. One moment, Union soldiers drove the Confederates back toward the trees. The next, the Confederates counterattacked, sweeping the field once more. The wheat, once tall and golden, was cut down by trampling feet, by musket fire, by the crash of battle. By evening, the wheat field had changed hands perhaps 6 times. No clear victor held it. but the ground was covered with the fallen and the crops lay flat and broken. To the west of the wheat field stood a jumble of rocks. Massive boulders tumbled together as if giants had left them behind. This was Devil's Den. The name seemed fitting as the battle reached it. Union sharpshooters had taken position among the stones, using the high perches to pick off advancing Confederates. But soon, the gray-clad soldiers surged up the rocky slopes. The fighting was close, brutal, hand to hand among the boulders. The stones themselves became shields. Soldiers ducked behind them, fired, and moved again. The noise echoed strangely among the rocks, musket cracks, shouts, the cries of the wounded. When the Confederates finally pushed the Union men from Devil's Den, the rocks remained covered in smoke and blood, and still the battle pressed onward. At the far southern edge of the line rose Little Round Top, not the tallest hill, but steep, rocky, and vital. If the Confederates could seize it, they could fire down into the Union flank, unraveling the entire fishhook. But fortune and quick thinking brought Union reinforcements just in time. General Gouverneur K. Warren, the Union's chief engineer, realized the hill was undefended. He rushed troops up its slopes, among them the 20th Maine Regiment under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. The 20th Maine was weary. They had marched long miles. They had little water, little rest. But they were given a simple, desperate order: hold this hill at all costs. The Confederates came in waves. Again and again they climbed the rocky slopes. The 20th Maine met them with musket fire, the sound rattling through the trees and stone. Casualties mounted. Ammunition ran low. Still, the line held. At last, with supplies nearly gone, Chamberlain made a bold choice. He ordered a bayonet charge. The men fixed steel to their rifles. With a shout, they swept down the slope, surprising the exhausted Confederate attackers. The charge broke the assault. Little Round Top remained in Union hands. That decision, a single moment of resolve, may have saved the entire Union line that day. Through all of this, the summer sun bore down. It was hot, unrelenting. Soldiers marched, fought, sweated in their wool uniforms. Canteens ran dry. Dust clung to their faces, and yet both sides endured. The afternoon stretched on into evening. The Union line bent, but it did not break. The Confederates had won ground, but not the victory Lee had hoped for. The fishhook still held. As the sun sank low, the fields of Gettysburg lay scarred. The Peach Orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, each had seen furious combat. Each was now silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of fires. The day was ending, but the battle was far from over. Both armies settled into uneasy positions. Campfires flickered across the hills. The night air grew cooler, and all knew tomorrow would bring yet more struggle. So ended the second day's afternoon struggle. It was fierce. It was costly. It was indecisive. But it showed something clear. The Union Army would not give way easily. And the Confederates, though brave and determined, could not break them with one blow. The stage was set for a third day. And on that third day, the fields of Gettysburg would see one of the most famous charges in history. But for now, let your thoughts drift. Picture the fields as they were when the fighting paused, the golden wheat flattened, the rocky slopes of Round Top glowing in the sunset, the peach orchard quiet once more. Let the images fade and rest. The sun was setting over Gettysburg. Its light stretched long across the fields, casting golden rays that soon softened into gray. The second day of battle had ended, though the echoes of gunfire still seemed to linger in the ears of the men who had lived through it. The afternoon had been thunder. Cannons, rifles, shouts, the clash of men on rocky hillsides. But now the noise was fading. The guns fell quiet. The smoke lifted slowly from the orchards and ridges. And in its place came something almost stranger than battle itself: silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence after struggle, a silence filled with groans, with whispers, with the faint shuffle of tired feet. It was the quiet of an army gathering its strength, of men too weary to speak, too shaken to move quickly. Across the fields where they had fought, the peach orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top, the ground lay broken. Fences splintered, trees stripped of branches, fields once full of crops now trampled into mud, and everywhere the still forms of those who would not rise again. The armies had fought each other to a standstill. Neither side had broken, but both were exhausted. The Confederates had pushed far, gained ground, yet failed to break the Union fishhook. The Union had bent, nearly cracked, but still held firm. And now, as darkness crept over the Pennsylvania hills, each side drew back to its own lines, too spent to do more. Fires began to flicker in the distance. Campfires, small at first, then more, dotting the hillsides like faint stars. The glow carried across the fields, a reminder that both armies still lived, still waited, still prepared for what tomorrow might bring. For the soldiers, the transition from battle to night was not easy. The rush of combat, the pounding of adrenaline, the fear, the chaos, all of it left the body trembling when it finally stopped. Men collapsed where they stood. Some leaned against trees or fences, staring blankly into the dusk. Others lay flat on the earth, too tired to even eat. Sleep came not as comfort, but as surrender. And yet there was little true rest. For the fields between the lines were filled with the wounded. They called out softly in the dark, their voices drifting like ghosts across the ground. Some cried for water, some for their mothers. Some said nothing at all, only breathing raggedly as life slipped away. Both armies sent stretcher-bearers into the gloom. Men with lanterns moved carefully, picking their way over rocks and fallen branches. They lifted the injured, carried them back to makeshift hospitals in barns and farmhouses. There, surgeons worked through the night. Their tools clattered, their saws rasped, their hands, practiced but weary, moved quickly in the dim light of candles and lamps. The moans of the patients mingled with the low murmur of doctors, with the prayers of chaplains who bent over the dying. The smell of blood, of smoke, of sweat hung heavy in the air. And yet, even here, even in the pain of night, there was a strange quietude, a rhythm. The war had paused. The guns had gone still. Only human voices remained. In the Union camps along Cemetery Ridge, men tried to gather themselves. They spoke in hushed tones. Some cursed General Sickles for moving his corps forward into the peach orchard. Others praised the courage of the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. But most were too tired for debate. They simply sat by their fires, eating hardtack, sipping what water they had left, staring into the flames as though hypnotized. On the Confederate side, along Seminary Ridge, the mood was no lighter. Longstreet's men had fought hard, pushed the Union nearly to its breaking point, but not enough. They, too, sat in silence, their faces gray with fatigue, their uniforms dark with dust and sweat. They thought of friends left behind in the wheat field, of comrades who would not rise in the morning. Some whispered that they had been close, so close to victory. But others wondered how much more blood would be needed. Night deepened. The stars came out, faint above the haze. The moon rose slowly, casting pale light over the battlefield. And with that light came a kind of haunting beauty. The fields, though scarred and broken, lay calm beneath the sky. The ridges were dark silhouettes against the horizon. The fires burned low, steady, and for a few hours the world seemed still, Yet in that stillness was dread. Every man knew that tomorrow would bring more. Lee had not abandoned his plan. The Union had not given up its ground. The battle was not finished. And so each soldier carried the heavy weight of expectation. Would they fight again at dawn? Would they live to see another nightfall? Some tried to write letters in the flickering light, words scrawled shakily onto scraps of paper. Letters to wives, to parents, to children back home. They wrote of love, of memory, of hope. Some confessed fear, though most tried to sound steady. They tucked the letters away, knowing that if they fell tomorrow, perhaps a comrade would carry the words back. Others simply lay back on the ground, eyes open to the stars. They thought of home, of farms, of small towns, of quiet rivers. They remembered the smell of bread baking, the sound of children laughing, the feel of grass under their bare feet. Memories drifted over them like a blanket, bringing comfort for a time. The wounded still cried out. Their voices grew weaker as the hours passed. Some were found and carried to safety. Others remained where they lay, fading slowly into silence. For them, the night was not a pause, but an end. And yet, even as death lingered, so too did life. A Union soldier shared a last piece of bread with a friend. A Confederate soldier hummed a hymn softly, his voice carrying into the dark. A nurse bent over a wounded boy, smoothing his hair, whispering words of kindness. In small ways, humanity endured, even in the midst of destruction. By midnight, the battlefield was hushed. The fires burned low, casting only faint light. The groans of the wounded became less frequent. Sleep, heavy and restless, took hold of the armies. But beneath that sleep, the tension never fully eased. Every man knew the morning would bring more struggle. The second day of Gettysburg was over, but it had not been decisive. The Union line had bent but not broken. The Confederates had struck hard but not shattered their enemy. Both sides had suffered terribly, both sides had given much, and both sides were left waiting. In the quiet hours before dawn, the hills and fields rested. The stones of Devil's Den cooled in the night air. The wheat field lay flat and silent. The peach orchard, once blooming, now scarred, seemed almost peaceful under the moonlight. Little Round Top, so fiercely defended, stood dark and watchful. All of it, every ridge, every fence, every farmhouse, waited for the morning, and so too did the men. Exhausted, haunted, yet bound by duty, they waited. For tomorrow would come, and with it the third day of Gettysburg. The morning of July 3rd began quietly. A soft light crept over the hills and fields, the kind of light that might have marked any summer dawn in Pennsylvania. The sky was pale blue, streaked with gentle clouds. Birds stirred in the trees. Dew clung to the grass. The air was still, carrying the coolness of night but promising heat to come. To any passing traveler it might have looked like peace. But for the thousands of men stretched across the ridges and fields of Gettysburg, this dawn carried a weight unlike any other. For 2 full days the battle had raged. The first day had been surprise, chaos, a Union retreat through the streets of town. The second day had been fury, attacks at the peach orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. The ground had been soaked in blood, the fields littered with men who would never rise again. And yet nothing had been decided. Neither army had broken. Neither side had claimed victory. And so, as July 3rd began, the battle still hung in the balance. The men of both armies rose slowly. Stiff from sleep, heavy with fatigue, they pulled themselves up from the earth. Some rubbed their eyes, some stretched aching limbs, some reached immediately for their rifles, never letting them stray too far from reach. The air was filled with the sound of campfires being kindled, of tin cups rattling, of murmured voices. The men ate what little they had: hardtack, coffee if they were lucky, scraps of bacon if supplies had not run out. Every bite was chewed slowly, not out of savor but out of weariness. They did not know if this meal would be their last. On the Union side, along Cemetery Ridge and the curved line that had been shaped like a great fishhook, soldiers stood watch. They looked out across the open fields that separated them from the Confederates. The fields stretched wide, open with little cover. They knew that if an attack came, it would have to cross that space. Some men took comfort in that distance. Others felt dread, imagining wave after wave of gray uniforms marching toward them. Officers moved quietly among the men, checking positions, giving calm orders. The Union Army had bent on the second day but had not broken. Now, reinforced and resolved, they stood ready to hold. General Meade had chosen his ground carefully. He had refused Lee's flanking attacks and kept his men anchored on strong positions. The ridges gave them height. The curves of the line gave them protection. They were tired, but they knew they were well placed. And as the morning light grew stronger, they waited, watchful. On the Confederate side, along Seminary Ridge, the mood was more restless. General Lee had ridden through the night, thinking, weighing his options. He had attacked the Union flanks on the second day and had come close, but not close enough. The hills had held. The Union line had not collapsed. Now he looked again at the field, at the long Union position stretched across the high ground. He believed the key was in the center. If he could break through there, if he could split the Union army in two, victory might finally be in reach. Lee's decision was bold, even daring. Some of his generals were uneasy. Longstreet in particular argued against it. He had little faith in a direct assault across open ground. He saw the Union position as too strong, too well defended. He urged Lee to move around to force the Union army to attack them instead. But Lee was firm. He had seen the Union line stretched thin. He believed a determined strike at the center could shatter it. And so, the plan was made. The men who would carry out that plan stirred awake. Pickett's division, fresh to the battlefield after days of marching, finally prepared to join the fight. They had not seen heavy action yet, and their energy contrasted with the exhaustion of so many others. They polished their rifles. They tightened straps and belts. They straightened their uniforms. For some, there was even a sense of pride, a sense of anticipation. They would finally have their chance to prove themselves. They did not yet know the price they would pay. Throughout the morning, the two armies watched each other across the open ground. Skirmishers moved cautiously along the edges, trading occasional shots. The sound of muskets cracked here and there, sharp but isolated. Yet for the most part, the field remained still. A heavy quiet stretched across it, the kind of quiet that presses on the chest, that makes every sound seem louder, every movement sharper. Men felt it deep in their bones. Something was coming, something larger than what had come before. The wounded from the day before still lay in the fields between the lines. Some had survived the night, clinging to life. They whispered faintly for water, for help. But the armies held back, neither side daring to venture too far into the open under watchful rifles. A few stretcher-bearers moved carefully, waving small flags, hoping to be spared from fire. They bent low, lifted bodies, carried them back, but many wounded were left where they were, waiting for an end that crept slowly as the sun rose higher. In the Union lines, soldiers sharpened bayonets, checked cartridges, stacked ammunition. Officers inspected artillery batteries, making sure every cannon was placed, every caisson ready. The guns had thundered for 2 days already, and they would thunder again. Horses shifted nervously, stamping the ground, the smell of sweat and leather mixed with the faint tang of powder that still lingered in the air from the day before. In the Confederate camps, couriers rode swiftly, carrying orders back and forth. Artillery was moved into position stretched along the ridge. Cannon after cannon was wheeled forward, unlimbered, readied for use. The gunners wiped sweat from their brows, adjusted aim, checked fuses. They knew their fire would have to prepare the way, would have to soften the Union line before the infantry advanced. The men themselves, the infantry who would march, felt the slow drag of waiting. They sat on the ground, rifles resting across their knees, staring out at the fields before them. Some talked quietly with comrades. Some laughed nervously, trading small jokes to keep fear at bay. Others wrote letters quickly, scratching words onto paper with hurried hands. They tucked the letters into pockets, hoping they would be found if they fell. Every man carried the weight of what might come, but none could know for sure. As the morning stretched on, the sun grew warmer. The haze of summer rose from the ground, shimmering faintly in the distance. The cicadas droned in the trees, their constant song weaving through the stillness. The smell of earth, grass, and sweat filled the air. The battlefield was alive, yet quiet, as though holding its breath. Lee himself remained calm. He believed in his men. He believed in their courage, their spirit, their resolve. He had seen them achieve miracles before against odds just as long, and now, with the Union Army drawn up before him, he believed the time had come for one final blow. His confidence steadied those around him, even if doubts still lingered. On the Union side, General Meade listened to reports, weighed his own decisions. He had prepared his line carefully, reinforcing the center where he suspected the attack might come. He knew the Confederates would try again. He knew the battle was not over, but he trusted his ground. He trusted his men. He resolved to hold, no matter what the day brought. The morning ticked slowly toward noon. Shadows shortened. The heat grew heavy. Sweat rolled down faces, dampened collars. The quiet pressed harder, like a pause in music that stretches just before the crash of sound. Men shifted restlessly. Some whispered prayers. Some closed their eyes, letting the sunlight warm their skin, imagining they were far away from this place. Across the wide fields, both armies faced each other, waiting. Each side knew the third day would decide the battle. Each side knew the stakes had grown beyond the town, beyond the ridges and orchards. The outcome here might shape the course of the war itself, and so they prepared, quietly, steadily, each moment carrying them closer to the storm that was to come. The morning hours passed. The sky brightened to clear blue. The birds that had sung at dawn grew quiet again, as if sensing what was near. The men of the Union crouched behind stone walls, behind fences, their rifles ready. The men of the Confederacy lined up in ranks, their flags rippling faintly in the breeze. The cannons stood silent, black mouths aimed at the enemy. All was still. It was the calm before the storm. And as the clock moved toward midday, both armies braced themselves for what would follow, for the clash that would mark the third day at Gettysburg. The sun had climbed high over Gettysburg by the time silence gave way to thunder. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery opened fire. 100 and more cannon lined along Seminary Ridge spoke at once, their booming echoes rolling like storms across the valley. Smoke blossomed thick and gray, drifting into the summer sky. The sound shook the ground, rattled the air, and filled the ears of every man across both armies. For nearly 2 hours, the bombardment went on. Cannon after cannon belched flame and smoke, shells arching high, descending onto the Union line. The roar was constant, a steady drumbeat of thunder. Earth flew into the air as shells struck. Trees shuddered and splintered. Stone walls cracked beneath the impacts. The ridge where the Union men stood seemed wrapped in fire and smoke. To the Confederates, it was meant as preparation. The artillery would break the Union line, silence the Union guns, weaken the defenses before the infantry moved. The gunners worked feverishly, swabbing barrels, ramming charges, pulling lanyards. Sweat poured down their faces, their shirts clung to their backs. The air grew heavy with the stinging scent of powder, acrid and sharp. But on the Union side, though shaken, the line held. General Meade's artillery had been drawn back slightly, ordered to conserve ammunition, to wait. Some Union guns fell silent not because they were destroyed, but because their officers wanted the enemy to think they had been. The Confederates believed their fire was working. They believed the ridge was being pounded into ruin. In truth, much of the Union line remained intact, crouched low behind stone walls, waiting. As the bombardment stretched on, the ground itself seemed to tremble. The sound carried for miles, heard in towns and farms far from the battlefield. Residents in their homes paused, listening to the rolling thunder, wondering what destruction it heralded. On the ridges themselves, men pressed their bodies closer to the earth, clutching rifles, teeth clenched, enduring the storm. Some closed their eyes and prayed, others counted the seconds between bursts. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the great cannonade slowed. The guns fired less and less. The air hung heavy with smoke, the field blurred and hazy. A strange stillness crept in, as if the world itself had paused. The Confederates believed the time had come. Across Seminary Ridge, long lines of gray and butternut began to form. Brigades gathered, regiments dressed their ranks, flags lifted high. The men of Pickett's division stepped forward, fresh to battle. Alongside them came Pettigrew's and Trimble's men, stretched wide in columns that reached far across the fields. In all, nearly 12,000 soldiers prepared to march. Officers rode before them, swords flashing in the sun, steadying the lines, urging courage. The order was given, drums beat faintly, and then the long gray lines began to move. They stepped out from the ridge and onto the open fields. The ground rolled gently before them, a mile of open space stretching to the Union line. The sun beat down on their faces, the air shimmered with heat. Above them smoke still drifted, curling lazily, but the silence now was eerie. For a moment, the guns were quiet. Only the steady tramp of boots, the flutter of flags, the low murmur of officers carried across the field. From the Union line, the sight was unforgettable. Across the haze, the long ranks of Confederates seemed endless. They marched in perfect alignment, banners waving, bayonets glinting like silver in the light. The men along Cemetery Ridge watched in awe and dread as the gray tide advanced. Some whispered in disbelief. Some tightened their grips on rifles. Some simply stared as though watching a vision move steadily toward them. The march was deliberate, steady, almost solemn. The Confederates moved with discipline, their ranks wide, their steps measured. They carried themselves as though this was not merely battle, but destiny. For them, this was the moment Lee had promised, the strike that would split the Union army in two, that might end the battle in victory. They marched with hope, with pride, with determination. But as they reached the midway point, the Union guns spoke. From the ridge, artillery that had lain silent now opened fire. Dozens of cannons flashed at once, the sound shaking the air. Shells whistled across the fields, exploding among the ranks. Smoke leapt skyward, dirt and grass flew. The march wavered, bent, but kept moving. Still the lines pushed on. Closer they came, and the Union guns turned to canister. Wide blasts of iron pellets sprayed across the fields, tearing through the ranks. Men fell, gaps opened, but the Confederates closed them. Officers shouted, waving swords, pointing forward. Flags dipped and rose again. The gray lines pressed on, step after step, under the storm. The field was wide, yet nowhere to hide. No ridge, no forest, no cover shielded them. Every yard forward was paid for in men. Yet still they came. The Union infantry, waiting behind stone walls, raised rifles and began to fire. A steady sheet of musketry cracked along the ridge, rolling volleys that cut into the oncoming ranks. The smoke thickened, the sound grew deafening. And yet, the Confederates advanced. They surged past the fences along Emmitsburg Road, climbing, breaking through, reforming on the other side. Their lines, once crisp, now wavered, broken into clusters. Still, they pushed on. Officers called them forward, voices straining to rise above the din. Flags pressed ahead, markers for men to rally around, colors bright even in the haze. Nearer and nearer they came to the Union line, into the very teeth of fire. Union regiments fired point blank, cannons unleashed double loads of canister, sheets of iron blasting across the field. Whole groups fell, but others rushed forward to fill the gaps. The determination was iron, but the cost grew unbearable. Some Confederates reached the low stone wall at the center of the Union line. For a moment they surged over it, a wedge breaking through. The high water mark, it would later be called. Here, for a few moments, the gray and the blue clashed in desperate struggle, hand to hand, bayonets and rifle butts, flags waving defiantly above the press. The Confederate banner stood almost within the Union line. Victory seemed close enough to touch. But the weight of the Union defense was too great. Reserves rushed to the point. Officers drove their men forward. Muskets fired from three sides, pouring into the breach. Cannon were wheeled to fire directly at the wall. The small wedge that had broken through could not hold. One by one, the Confederate regiments began to falter. The momentum slowed. The surge turned to hesitation, and then it began to fall back. The gray lines, so proud and steady in their march, now bent and broke. Men turned, some running, some staggering, some carried by comrades. The field they had crossed, once alive with ordered ranks, now lay strewn with fragments. Flags drooped, pulled backward. Officers tried to rally, tried to call men forward again, but the storm of Union fire was too fierce. The attack had spent itself. Slowly, the retreat began. Back across the fields they came, fewer now, broken into scattered groups. The Union guns did not relent, their fire following the retreat. Smoke still hung heavy, blotting the summer sky. The cheers of Union men rose along the ridge, mingled with the crack of muskets, the deep boom of cannon. For the Confederates, the charge was over. The grand assault that Lee had hoped would break the Union center had failed. 12,000 had marched. Only a fraction returned. What had begun with such precision ended in fragments and silence. The fields lay quiet again, except for the groans of the wounded, the creak of stretchers, the faint calls across the smoke. On Seminary Ridge, General Lee rode among his men. He spoke calmly, steadily, telling them it was his fault, not theirs. He urged them not to blame themselves, to hold strong, to prepare for what must come next. His voice carried authority, but in his eyes was the weight of what had been lost. On Cemetery Ridge, Union men stood in wonder at what they had endured. They had held the line, they had faced the storm and had not broken. Their cheers rose again, tired but triumphant, echoing across the fields that only hours before had been filled with marching gray ranks. As the afternoon waned, the smoke drifted slowly away. The sun lowered, casting long shadows across the fields. The ground that had been marched across so bravely now lay silent, the echoes of cannon and musket fading into memory. The Battle of Gettysburg was not yet fully finished, but the great assault was done. The day that had begun with silence had ended with thunder and returned again to quiet. The calm before the storm had been broken, the storm had raged, and now the calm returned, heavy with the knowledge of what had passed. Pickett's charge would be remembered not only for its fury, but for its futility. It was a moment when courage met immovable defense, when hope broke against stone. The men who had marched across those fields carried the weight of that moment forever, and the land itself seemed to hold it in silence. As the last light of July 3rd faded, the armies still faced one another across the ridges, but both knew deep within that the high tide of the Confederacy had been reached. The Union line had held, and from that ridge, history had turned. The smoke lifted slowly, as if the land itself was exhaling after 3 days of fury. The cannons that had roared, the rifles that had cracked in steady rhythm, the cries that had carried across the hills, all fell silent. What lingered was a heavy stillness, a silence filled not with peace, but with the weight of exhaustion and loss. The Battle of Gettysburg was over, though its echoes would live on. As dawn broke on July 4th, the 4th of July, a day that in other years had been celebrated with fireworks and laughter, the fields of Pennsylvania were littered with broken fences, shattered trees, and countless men who would never rise again. Both armies had endured one of the most intense struggles in American history, and now the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under General Robert E. Lee, began its retreat. It was not a dramatic collapse, not a rout, but a somber, steady withdrawal. Lee's men were weary, many of them limping, many of them wounded. Their ranks, once proud and full of confidence, now bore the look of men who had been asked too much, who had marched too far, and who had suffered too greatly. Wagons filled with wounded stretched for miles, creaking slowly down the roads that led back toward Virginia. The rain began to fall, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to weep upon the broken fields. The Union Army under General George Meade did not pursue immediately. Meade, cautious and careful, knew his own army was battered as well. The fields they stood upon were strewn with their own dead, their own wounded, their own reminders of how costly this victory had been. Meade had won, yes, but he had also endured staggering losses. The men who remained on Cemetery Ridge and the Round Tops looked out at the quiet fields with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. They had held. They had stood firm against wave after wave. But at what cost? The aftermath of Gettysburg was unlike anything the countryside had ever seen. More than 160,000 men had taken part in the battle. Over 50,000 of them were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire regiments had been nearly destroyed. Families across the North and South would soon receive letters, some official, some written hastily by fellow soldiers, telling them that their sons, their brothers, their fathers would not be returning home. On the fields themselves, the work of tending to the wounded began. Churches, barns, and farmhouses were turned into makeshift hospitals. Surgeons worked tirelessly, often with little more than crude tools and rough bandages. The cries of the injured replaced the thunder of battle. Soldiers who had once faced one another across lines of fire now lay side by side, sharing water, sharing comfort, sometimes even sharing final words. The humanity that war often hides came back in small gestures, hands clasped, prayers whispered, kindness shown between enemies. For the people of Gettysburg, the town itself became overwhelmed by the scale of what had happened. Civilians who had hidden in cellars during the fighting now emerged to find their streets crowded with the wounded and the dying. Homes were opened, kitchens emptied, wells drawn dry in an effort to care for the armies that had passed through. What had been a quiet crossroads town was now forever etched into history, its name forever tied to the events of those 3 terrible days. For General Lee, the retreat was more than just a movement of men. It was a turning point. His invasion of the North had failed. His army, though still dangerous, would never again be able to mount such a grand offensive. The confidence that had carried the Confederacy through victory after victory was shaken. Lee himself, once nearly untouchable in his reputation, now felt the sting of responsibility. He reportedly told his men, "It is all my fault," acknowledging the weight of the decisions that had led to the failed assault of Pickett's charge. Yet his men still revered him, still followed him with devotion, even as they trudged southward in defeat. On the Union side, the mood was complex. There was triumph, of course, a sense that at last the tide had turned. Gettysburg was the first great victory in the Eastern Theater that truly blunted Lee's power. Combined with the Union victory at Vicksburg in the West, which happened almost simultaneously, July of 1863 marked a turning point in the Civil War. For the first time, it seemed possible that the Union might not only endure, but prevail. And yet, that triumph was not celebrated with joy, but with solemn reflection. Too many men had been lost, too many families would mourn. The victory was real, but it was soaked in blood. As the days passed, the dead had to be buried. Rows upon rows of shallow graves dotted the hillsides. Soldiers, both Union and Confederate, were laid to rest often where they had fallen. In time, many of these bodies would be reinterred in what would become the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. It was there, months later, that President Abraham Lincoln would come to speak, delivering the Gettysburg Address, a speech so brief yet so profound that it would forever define the meaning of the sacrifice made on those fields. But in the summer of 1863, that cemetery was only just beginning to take shape, as men with shovels worked day after day to give rest to the thousands who could no longer march. Night on the battlefield after the fighting was unlike anything else. The glow of campfires returned, but now it was subdued, almost mournful. The crackle of flames replaced the crack of muskets. Men sat quietly, staring into the fire, lost in their own thoughts. Some wrote letters home, trying to describe what they had seen, though words often failed. Others prayed or sang softly, their voices carrying into the night air like fragile reminders of life amidst so much death. And all knew that the war was not over. Gettysburg had been fought and won, but the larger struggle stretched ahead with many more battles yet to come. The fields themselves, scarred by battle, would take years to heal. Farmers returned to find fences broken, crops trampled, livestock gone. Cannonballs were still embedded in walls, bullets lodged in trees. For years afterward, plows would turn up rusted bayonets, fragments of shells, and even bones. The land remembered, even when men tried to move on. The human cost was impossible to measure fully. Numbers tell part of the story, thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, but numbers cannot capture the grief of a mother receiving news of her son, the emptiness at a family table where a father once sat, the silence of a brother who would never return. Both North and South carried these wounds. Both would feel them long after the war ended. And yet, out of the ashes of Gettysburg, there was also a sense of endurance. The Union had been tested, and it had held. The Confederacy had struck hard, but the line had not broken. From this point forward, the war would shift. The South would fight mostly on the defensive, its hopes of invading the North and forcing recognition by foreign powers slipping away. The North, emboldened, would begin to press harder, though still at a terrible cost. As July 4th gave way to July 5th, the Confederate columns continued their slow retreat, harried by Union cavalry but shielded by Lee's rear guard. The rain fell steadily, turning roads into rivers of mud, making the journey even more miserable. Wagons overturned, supplies were lost, wounded men cried out in pain with every jolt. And yet somehow the Army of Northern Virginia kept moving step by weary step back toward the safety of the Shenandoah Valley. Behind them, the Union Army remained on the field. General Meade, though criticized later for not pursuing more aggressively, made the cautious decision to consolidate his victory rather than risk a reckless chase. For the men who had fought and survived, there was some comfort in simply being alive, in being able to breathe the fresh air of Pennsylvania, in knowing they had faced the hardest test and endured. The aftermath of Gettysburg was not only military but deeply personal. For those who had stood on Little Round Top in the wheat field, at the Angle, or on Cemetery Hill, the memories of what they had seen would never fade. Decades later, veterans would return to these fields, walking slowly among the monuments that had been raised in their honor, shaking hands with former enemies, remembering friends who had never grown old. Gettysburg was not just another battle. It was a crossroads of history. In those 3 days, the fate of the nation tilted. The Confederacy's high tide had reached its furthest point. The Union had shown it could withstand the storm. The war would go on for nearly 2 more years, but the shadow of Gettysburg would hang over every march, every camp, every battle that followed. In the quiet that followed, the hills of Pennsylvania stood unchanged, rolling, green, timeless. Birds returned to the trees. Streams continued to flow. Life, in its steady way, resumed. But for those who had been there, for those who had seen what human will and human sacrifice could create and destroy, Gettysburg would never be just another place. It was sacred ground. And so, as we reflect on the aftermath, we remember not only the movements of armies or the strategies of generals, but the lives of ordinary men who bore extraordinary burdens. We remember their endurance, their suffering, and their sacrifice. We remember that out of their struggle came not only death, but also the hope of a nation preserved. This was Gettysburg. Its echoes linger still. The fields are quiet now. The thunder of cannon, the cries of men, the marching of thousands, all of it has passed into memory. The hills of Gettysburg lie still, covered by grass and sunlight, dotted with the faint traces of what once was. And yet, even in their silence, they hold echoes of a story that has never faded. A story of a summer's clash that came to shape the destiny of a nation. When the guns fell silent on the evening of July 3rd, neither army could fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. The fields were littered with reminders of the terrible cost, but also of the resolve of 2 great forces that had collided here. Gettysburg was not just another battle. It was a turning point. It became the place where the tide began to shift, where the long struggle of the Civil War started its slow march toward conclusion. And though the war would rage on for nearly 2 more years, something had changed. The hopes of the Confederacy dimmed on these Pennsylvania ridges, while the Union found a new confidence, a reassurance that the cause for which it fought might still endure. In the days and months that followed, the town of Gettysburg itself became a symbol. Its citizens, once caught in fear as armies swept through their quiet streets, now became caretakers of the memory of what had happened here. Farmers whose fields had been torn by shot and shell worked to restore the land, but they also remembered what it had cost. Barns and homes that had sheltered the wounded bore silent testimony to the suffering. Every road, every fence, every stone wall seemed to whisper the story to those willing to listen. Gettysburg had become not just a place on the map, but a name that carried weight across the country. As the war went on, soldiers and families alike thought back to Gettysburg. It was the moment when the Confederacy's reach into the North was stopped. It was the moment when Union arms, though battered and bloodied, had held firm against the storm. It was also the moment when Americans began to understand more deeply the scale of the conflict, the enormous sacrifices it demanded, and the determination required to see it through to the end. Gettysburg reminded both sides that the war was not just about armies and generals, but about the very survival of the nation itself. Months later, in November of 1863, the eyes of the nation turned again to these quiet hills. A cemetery had been established on the very ground where so many Union soldiers had fallen. It was here that President Abraham Lincoln came to dedicate the soldiers' national cemetery. His words were brief, barely 2 minutes in length, but they carried a weight far beyond their brevity. Standing among the graves, Lincoln spoke of a nation conceived in liberty, tested by a great civil war, and charged with ensuring that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address, as it came to be known, transformed the meaning of the battle. It gave the sacrifice of those who had fallen a larger purpose. They had not died in vain, Lincoln reminded the country. They had given their lives so that freedom and union might endure. In the years since, Gettysburg has remained a place of remembrance. Monuments now dot the fields where men once fought. Stone and bronze mark the positions of regiments, brigades, and batteries, honoring their service and ensuring that their deeds are not forgotten. Visitors walk the same ground where soldiers once stood, imagining the scenes of smoke and thunder, but also reflecting on the silence that followed. Each monument, each inscription, is a voice from the past, calling us to remember not only the struggle, but the ideals that were at stake. For the nation, Gettysburg became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of endurance. It stood as a reminder that unity could be tested but preserved. It showed that even in the darkest of times, a path forward could be found. And for countless families who had lost loved ones here, it became sacred ground, a place to grieve, to honor, and to find meaning in the sacrifice. The hills of Gettysburg came to embody the sorrow of war, but also the hope of peace. The legacy of Gettysburg is not confined to the 19th century. For generations, Americans have looked back to these fields as a lesson. Soldiers have studied the maneuvers, learning from the successes and failures of commanders. Leaders have drawn inspiration from the courage of ordinary men who stood firm under extraordinary pressure. Citizens have listened to Lincoln's words and found in them a reminder of the values on which the nation rests. And each time the story is told, the battle becomes not just history, but part of the ongoing narrative of what it means to strive for unity and liberty. And yet, beyond the speeches and the monuments, beyond the military studies and the historical accounts, there remains something quieter, something more personal. It is the memory of individual lives, of men who marched here from distant states, who fought and fell far from home. Each grave in the cemetery marks not just a soldier, but a son, a brother, a father, a friend. Their stories, though many were never fully told, are woven into the fabric of Gettysburg's legacy. When we speak of the battle, we speak of them. When we walk these fields, we walk in their footsteps. And when we pause in silence, we honor the dreams they carried and the price they paid. As the decades passed, Gettysburg's fields saw peace return. Grass grew tall where lines of battle once stretched. Birds sang again where cannon had roared. Children played on hillsides where soldiers had once clashed. The land healed, even if the scars of memory remained. And in that healing, perhaps there is another lesson. That time, though it cannot erase the past, can soften its edges, allowing us to remember with reverence rather than with pain alone. Gettysburg today is not a place of sorrow alone, but a place of reflection, where history and memory meet in quiet harmony. The story of Gettysburg is one chapter in a larger story. The story of a nation that endured a great trial, that suffered deeply, but that emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. The Civil War tested the very foundations of America, and Gettysburg was one of the tests that mattered most. It was here that the Union proved its resilience. It was here that ideals were tested in fire, and it was here that a vision for a united future began to take clearer shape. As we close our journey through these fields, let us remember that history is not distant. It lives with us, in the values we uphold, in the lessons we draw, in the quiet reminders of sacrifice. Gettysburg is not merely a story of cannons and charges, of victories and defeats. It is a story of people, of courage and endurance, of hope carried through darkness. It is a story that invites us to pause, to reflect, and to carry forward the meaning of what was done here. Tonight, as you rest, let the echoes of Gettysburg drift softly in your thoughts. Picture the rolling hills, the stone fences, the open fields bathed in moonlight. Imagine the silence that followed the storm when weary men lay down and the world grew quiet again. Let that quiet ease your own thoughts, reminding you that even after struggle, peace can come. The fields are quiet now. The battle is over. The voices of the past are at rest, and so may you be.